Picture a security team on an early morning. They pull up their vulnerability remediation queue. It's clean, no unpatched devices. But what they don't see is that 3 of their devices are still vulnerable to attackers because they require manual remediation. Those were never tracked as separate items, never verified, and never signed off. Well, this is a gap that many teams are still missing.
Welcome to Shadow Talk, a cybersecurity podcast powered by ReliaQuest, the leader in agentic AI security operations. I'm Tehman Tariq, Senior Manager of Gray Matter Operations.
And I'm John Dilgen, Threat Intelligence Analyst. And today we're digging into something that should make every security team stop and ask a tough question. What if the devices your team marks as fully patched are still vulnerable to attackers?
And as John mentioned, this episode we unpack that exact gap. Our threat research team wrote a detailed report on this specific campaign, but the design gap exposed in the report and this episode is one we've seen before and will continue to see again.
Yeah, exactly. And that is really the vulnerability required manual post-patch steps or configuration changes that the patch itself didn't include. And what makes this so critical is that the devices looked remediated. The firmware version matched, the ticket itself was closed. From every normal monitoring perspective, these were healthy devices.
And that's the gap initial access brokers have found, right? They walked through a door that seemed locked from the inside, but in reality, it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. And in this episode, we're going to walk through how these attacks happen, how the bypass works, how fast the attackers moved once they were in, and really what 2 specific workflow changes can close that gap. So let's examine this. So in this episode, we're going to be highlighting that report you mentioned, Tehman, which really covered a campaign of exploitation around CVE 2024 12802, or an authentication bypass in SonicWall's SSL VPN appliances. Now, in the majority of incidents that we investigated in the report, the affected devices had the correct firmware version applied. The patch management workflow checked the version, it matched the advisory requirements, and the device came off the remediation queue with a clean bill of health, which was technically accurate, except the advisory also required 6 manual LDAP reconfiguration steps on top of the firmware update. And those were steps that were never completed as they had to be done separately. Now, the reality is that most patch manager workflows don't track these as separate tasks to be completed after the patching.
And this is where the workflow design matters. A lot of patch management processes are built around the firmware version as the single completion step. The version matches the advisory, and then what our team does is that they consider that task is closed and the device is out of the queue. That works when the advisory's only requirement is a firmware update. But when the advisory also documents post-patch steps that need to be taken, a firmware version check alone doesn't tell you whether those steps were done. The device looks fully remediated on every workflow view, but in reality, it isn't.
Yeah, and so importantly, from the defender's perspective, the device looks completed, but from the attacker's side, it's still wide open. Now, real quick, I also want to explain the bypass mechanism behind this CVE. And simply put, there are 2 different username formats that a user could authenticate with, UPN and SAM or SAM, with MFA really only being applied to one. Now, more specifically, the authentication logic on these devices treats a user's UPN or the user principal name and their SAM account name as separate identities, with MFA requirements only applying to one of those formats, whereas the other goes through without an MFA check. Now, here's what's important from an operational perspective. The groups that are behind this are running what looks like a very disciplined campaign to broker initial access. They come in through the VPN, authenticate, sweep for domain joint assets, test for reused credentials, and then log out. All of this happens in about 30 to 60 minutes across all the intrusions we saw. And the important fact that they're voluntarily logging out really shows that these actors aren't staying in the environment and deploying ransomware. Instead, they're establishing the access, validating it, and leaving. And that's consistent with what we see initial access brokers do, who sell access to downstream operators for those follow on attacks. Another important element of this campaign that we saw was around the credential brute forcing. And we saw as few as 13 authentication attempts before the attacker was able to land a valid credential pair. Now, normally it would take hundreds or thousands of these attempts. So, this really shows that it's likely the attackers are testing the old exposed passwords here, and users are reusing them with only minor changes.
There's also an important parallel I want to name because it highlights how the gap we're discussing has been a consistent problem. Back in 2023, we saw the Citrix bleed vulnerability, and the post patch requirement there had the same exact design. There was a firmware update alone that was completely insufficient. Defenders also had to manually terminate active sessions and rotate credentials afterwards. Teams that applied the patch didn't complete those manual steps and they remained exposed. In some cases, for weeks after the patch was marked as applied.
Yeah, and that's an important point because the pattern is continuing here. And not only is the gap serious in this current campaign, but it's also showing up across environments. And the question for teams really is, what happens when an attacker finds that gap? How much runway do they actually have to exploit it? So, Tamon, can you walk us through that some?
Yep. And let's put some time on the clock here because the attacker's timeline in this investigation is the thing that forces our current response processes to come into question. So we can look at one specific case that we investigated. The attacker authenticated through the VPN and reached a domain joined file server in under 30 minutes. The full sequence was initial authentication, internal recon, they attempted pre ransomware staging, and this took roughly 40 minutes. And it's not just this investigation, that's consistent with the average, about that 34-minute breakout time that we report on in our ATR. And we've mentioned dozens of times on this podcast as well.
Yeah, and just to back that up, as we've mentioned before, if your response workflow relies on human review and manual containment, you're giving the attacker too large of a window to operate.
Right. And now let's take a look at this picture because it gets a lot more complicated when you look at the behavioral detections. In one case we investigated, the threat actor attempted to deploy post exploitation tooling and a driver designed to disable endpoint protection. Both were blocked by the endpoint detection. That part worked, but the actor didn't stop there. They pivoted. Instead of continuing to push on the tool deployment, the actor switched to manually reviewing files on the file server using a standard text editor. They were browsing directory structures, reviewing config files, reading documents. That activity blends with normal activity that we would see on a file server. It generates events, but the events alone look like normal user activity.
Yeah, and so to really translate the practitioner reality from that here is that detections were able to stop the tooling, but really could not prevent the file access entirely. The attacker adapted in real time and was able to hide inside the noise of standard operations. So it's just an important reminder that actors don't just simply fold when their first tool gets blocked.
Exactly, John. And next, let's talk about that third dimension of what is most exposed here. And it's the one that's the hardest to fix immediately. The SonicWall Gen 6 devices that were at the center of the campaign that reached end of life in April 16th, 2026, no further firmware updates or vendor support was provided. The patch that was supposed to close the gap is the last patch these devices will ever get. And this is something we've seen with similar campaigns that exploit SonicWall devices. These devices are still in production across a lot of environments, especially in organizations that grew through acquisitions. When you inherit infrastructure, you don't always inherit a complete picture of the asset inventory. A device that came in through an M&A integration may have been running for years without ever fully entering your organization's standard patch management process. It's not that anyone made a deliberate choice to leave it unmanaged. It just never got discovered and brought into your program, which compounds the gap that we've been describing here. A device that never fully entered the patch management program is also a device that never had its post patch manual steps tracked or verified.
Yeah, and really to add on to that, the attack surface that we're describing around these devices, or really vulnerabilities in perimeter edge devices, is the same one that we see threat groups consistently target. And as a reminder, we've seen similar TTPs used by groups like Akira Ransomware and many others.
The attacker only needed 40 minutes and they were able to target a gap many organizations still have. After the break, we'll cover what it takes to close that gap.
Shadow Talk is brought to you by ReliaQuest, the global leader in AI cybersecurity. ReliaQuest helps enterprise cybersecurity teams contain threats in minutes with its agentic AI security operations platform, Grey Matter. ReliaQuest makes security possible for the most trusted enterprise brands in the world. Learn more at ReliaQuest.com.
Welcome back. We've established the gap and how fast attackers move through it. Now let's talk about what actually closes it.
Yeah. So starting out, number one is going to be the workflow change that really prevents the gap from opening in the first place. And it's really something we've been alluding to all episode here. But to be clear, it's a past management process conversation that needs to happen. The tooling that most teams use is already capable of tracking this. But the question is whether the process has been designed to require it. So to restate, a lot of patch management workflows are configured to close an advisory ticket when the firmware version is updated. Full stop. But in the SonicWall and the Citrix Bleed examples, these advisories also included documented manual remediation steps. Now, that information may have been in the ticket notes, but if the workflow doesn't include a separate verification line for those steps, they'll get skipped by many teams, like we've seen in this report.
The second area is how the advisory was scored and what that scoring divergence means for how organizations prioritize it. The CISA authorized data publisher rated the CVA a 9.1, so a critical. That's a score that should put an advisory at the top of the urgent remediation queue. The vendor's own advisory carried a 6.5, so a medium score, which is lower on that same vulnerability. Organizations that are pulling their prioritization from the vendor score alone would have queued this as a routine update, an advisory that deserved urgent manual verification treatment. And this is an important point. This is not about the vendor scoring it wrong. The CVE prioritization from only a single authority is an incomplete policy.
Yeah, and I want to double down on that because, Taman, this is something we've spoken about in length in previous episodes. We had an episode in February where we talked about the patch management process and what organizations can do to fix that. One of the things we really spoke about there was the limitation of using only the CVE scoring around vulnerability management. And what we recommended, I'll just highlight one quick piece of that, was to use another scoring system like EPSS or the exploit prediction scoring system. And this system builds its signal from real-time exploitability context, including a proof of concept availability, observed attacker targeting, as well as asset prevalence in the wild. It really estimates the 30-day probability of exploitation in a way that's closer to the attacker's behavior than a static severity rating. EPSS gives you another severity rating that's grounded in what's actually happening in the threat environment.
And based off of what John just explained, I want to take a moment to ask a governance question for the leaders in the room. Does your vulnerability management policy specify who scores to trust when scores from organizations disagree on that same CVE? And do you supplement that with other sources such as EPSS?
Yeah, good question. And then finally, to round things out, the third change here we're going to talk about is going to be on the response side. The numbers we've highlighted in this report, as well as in many other previous reports, make it pretty clear that manual response is just not keeping up. So we established the timeline here. In the case we saw, initial authentication to file server access happened in under 30 minutes, and the full intrusion sequence played out across roughly 40 minutes. Now, I know we harp a lot on automated response and why it's so critical in every episode. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of that here. But what I do want to highlight is a specific use case of automated response that's relevant to this campaign. So in the SonicWall devices, there's a session type field within the authentication logs, and it shows a value of sesh equals CLI. And that was across all the brute forcing attempts we observed. Now, really, the field identifies the connection as a machine initiated authentication, or the kind that's being generated by a script or some kind of automated tooling. It's a high confidence signal for brute forcing. Now, this signal can then be paired with the automatic blocking of a source IP or a source host to ensure that the brute forcing is not successful. Another element of this campaign is, since we saw those old passwords being first reused by users as they create new passwords, and then from there, once they're known, being targeted by threat actors, teams can take their automated response a step further and automatically reset passwords for the user accounts that are being brute forced to reduce the chance that reused passwords will then be brute forced. This can also be combined with something like a workflow automation of an email or a portal notification to that user to give them targeted information and ensure that the old passwords are not being reused, really warning them of the threat.
Let's bring this home. So there's two major takeaways, one for the leaders listening and one for the operators. I'll kick things off for the leaders. Two governance gaps came up in this episode. First, patch management workflows that treat firmware versions as the sole completion step, with no separate tracking for post-patch manual steps. Second, vulnerability prioritization policies that rely on a single scoring authority when multiple authoritative sources exist and frequently disagree. Both of these are process design questions. The morning action that I have for leaders is ask your team what class of perimeter device advisory, specifically advisories that document manual post-patch steps, should automatically trigger an escalated remediation queue in your vulnerability management policy. That's the question. The answer there will tell you whether your current policy distinguishes that class or treats all advisories exactly the same. If the policy doesn't distinguish that class today, that's the gap to close before the next advisory lands. And based on what we've seen in edge device advisories over the last several years, there will always be a next advisory.
Yeah, there certainly will, Tehman. Now, taking things down to the operator side. So, back to what I mentioned earlier, the best signal for detection and response efforts here is going to be in that session type field of your VPN authentication logs, specifically that sesh equals CLI value that identifies the connection as being a machine authentication. And again, it shows up on all the brute forcing we saw in this report, which really means that your team has a high confidence detection signal that fires early on in the attack chain. So you can also detect and respond on the pivot that comes one step later. And this is when that session type transitions from CLI to GMS with the same source IP. And that GMS value, it's assigned the moment the threat actor moves from credential harvesting to the active internal access. So to be more specific, the CLI by itself is the brute forcing phase, whereas the CLI to GMS transition on the same source IP is the successful initial access. Again, another great opportunity for detection and automated response. So the 10-minute tomorrow morning action for practitioners: open your VPN authentication log sources and verify two things. First, whether that sesh equals CLI authentication events are being ingested and ready for alerts. So we need to have those logs fed to our alerting, make sure they're ready to fire. And then second, whether that CLI to GMS transition on the same source IP is an event that your automated response is set up to act on. If either of those answers are no, you have a detection gap for this campaign that you can remediate. So what we covered today is a process gap that a lot of teams are facing right now. The same gap has surfaced before and it will surface again. A clean dashboard reflects what your workload tracked. However, the attacker can still exploit patched devices. That is the operational reality that this campaign and report showed. Well, that's all for this week. Thanks for listening to another episode of Shadow Talk. If you'd like to read the full report, it's available in the link tree below. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, we're just an email away. You can send your questions to shadowtalk@reliaquest.com. Finally, please don't forget to subscribe so you get next week's episode delivered direct to your podcast platform of choice. And we really appreciate it if you can rate and review Shadow Talk wherever you listen. It will make a huge difference and help us reach new listeners. We'll be back next week with another episode of Shadow Talk.